Alan is, of course, very well known. He started, I think, in the 1960s as a pediatrician, but also as an anesthesiologist. And then I think initially were very important in developing techniques with which it became possible to secure the survival of very premature babies. And that's now, of course, a major achievement. But then you moved, interestingly enough, into adult medicine, and again you made a major contribution, as far as I could make out, on the care of intensive care that is now highly developed also technologically. But you were also always interested not just in medicine, but also in politics and the connection between the two. I think you always saw yourself as a mediator between the two. And as a result, I think you were involved in advising, for example, Bob Dole when he was a candidate for the presidency. And you, time and again, involved yourself in politics, and also, interestingly enough, very local politics, because there was the whole problem of violence among youngsters, and you were also involved in trying to establish regimes and advice to deal with conflict among young people. And then, of course, you were always concerned with the academy, and I just wanted to mention that I think you did one great thing towards the end of your life, namely you endowed
This is
a
not
chair.
the end of my life.
Yeah, well, okay. Sorry.
Maybe you know something.
I wish you a long life. And you were involved in a chair which is now, I think, here at Columbia, concerned with critical care in anesthesiology. Well, there is Jeanne, of course, your sparring partner, and I think I would like to mention her also briefly, because you will remember that she got her Bachelor of Science at City College a number of years ago, but then got her PhD in physical chemistry at the City University here in New York, and joined Columbia in 1981. And then, of course, in public health, I believe in the Mailman School. And then you took retirement in 2007 and became an Emeritus. And then, however, you didn't give up, but accepted a new appointment at the City University, the Downtown Medical Center, where you were not only a professor and as an associate dean, but also the chair of the environmental health department. So again, you had very influential, important positions there in public health until in 2013 you returned to Columbia and accepted a teaching position here, which you have occupied. And there are two achievements that I would briefly like to mention. First of all, your research on the Vietnam War from a public health perspective, and I think you were very, very important in spreading understanding and knowledge about herbicides, and especially Agent Orange, and its impact on veterans who have fought in the Vietnam War. And then there is another important related field that you achieved in, and that is women's health and occupational health in particular. And you published several books and many articles on these subjects, and with Stephen, your husband, ultimately got the American Legion Distinguished Service Medal for all your services in this particular field in Vietnam. And finally, of course, you are our president. I don't think this organization would be what it now is. I think one of the best emeriti organizations in the country now without Jeanne. So first of all, I would like to welcome Alan and also Jeanne, and I'm sure that we will have a very good conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Alan wants to know whether he should begin, and I think it's inevitable that you have to begin.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm very grateful to you, particularly Jeanne, for this honor to be chosen to be the epic speaker for the coming year or the past year, I can't remember. But
it was supposed to be last year, but COVID, we got COVID.
Then I got COVID, and I recovered. Thank you very much. Shall I go on?
Well, I just want to first of all, I have to tell you that it is a huge honor to be able, that when we invited you for the conversation, that you said that you would like me to ask you questions and have a conversation with me, and that's really a major honor, and I thank you for that. Although you're a bit ornery to try to get to, you want to talk first, and please go ahead, and then we'll go back to the questions.
Well, thank you very much. And let me begin by telling you something about my time at Columbia College. I came to Columbia in 1951, and looking behind me at the president's house reminds me of an experience I had when I was a freshman. I was advised to choose an extracurricular activity, as all good college students do, and athletics was going to be out, no way, and I wasn't really that interested in the Spectator, although I did write for the Spectator for 1 year. I thought I would try out for the Glee Club, and before the audition, I was encouraged to join a group of freshmen who were also auditioning for the Glee Club and go over to the president's house and sing Christmas carols for the president. And after a silent night and maybe jingle bells, the door opened up and there was the most famous American, Dwight David Eisenhower, in the doorway. And he welcomed us in. I think there were about 12 of us, and eggnog was served. And in a few minutes, there was a voice from Upper Landing. Mamie, Ike, don't bring them up. That's what I meant. But he shook our hands, and the next year he became President of the United States. And there was an experience up here, I don't know if many of you know, it was called the Surrender of Morningside Heights. And it was because Eisenhower ran for president, and the man that he defeated in the primary was Howard Taft from Ohio. And Taft came over to Morningside Heights and told or advised Eisenhower, don't bring up Senator Joe McCarthy, leave it out. And Eisenhower never referred to McCarthy in his campaign against Adlai Stevenson, although Stevenson did. And that was referred to as the Surrender of Morningside Heights, and I remember that very well. So, and Columbia College, when I attended, was the smallest Ivy League school, only about 500 students in my class. And I was a commuter for the first year, and the subway ride was over an hour long each way, but I managed to get through. Columbia, when I attended, still had a quota system, and there was an aroma of anti-Semitism on the campus. There were very few Jewish tenured professors. My freshman chemistry class was held on Saturday, and our exams were on Saturday for chemistry. At that time, the tuition was $600, and scholarships were widely available, no financial aid or loans, and no accumulated debt. There were many distinguished faculty members some of whom I had: Jacques Barzun, Moses Haddis, Polycarp Cush, Lionel Trilling, history professors were two of my favorite, was James Shenton and Walter Metzger. Maybe some of you remember those names. It was still a great challenge to get into medical school. A significant number of Americans were not able to get into American medical schools, and they went to the Caribbean or to Europe. And organic chemistry was the make or break class. And my professor was Charles Dawson. About 25 years later, when, as an anesthesiologist, I noticed Charles Dawson's name on my list of patients for the next day. In those days, patients actually came in a day or two before surgery to be worked up. Doesn't happen anymore. And I was assigned to anesthetize Professor Dawson. And I came into the room, and I hadn't seen him in 25 years, and I said, Professor Dawson, I had you for orgo, and that's what we called organic chemistry. And tomorrow I'm going to give you anesthesia. And then almost reflexively he asked, what grades did you get? And I said, B and B plus. That's pretty good, pretty good. And then he seemed much more relaxed. And he went to sleep. I'm not going to go into details now about my education, but I did want to say something about my last years. Because I think I didn't expect this in my training to become a hospital administrator, but in 1992, Bill Speck, who was my former resident in the neonatal ICU, I think maybe in revenge for what I did to him as when he was a resident, he chose me to become the chief medical officer and his chief of staff. Now, chief medical officer was a line job, and I had about 7 or 8 people reporting to me, and that was a relatively easy job. But being a chief of staff was a staff position. I reported only to one person, to Bill Speck, the president, and that was a challenging job because it basically you did things that the chair didn't want to do, and that had to do much about the relationship between the hospital and the medical school. And so I had to go to meetings on the main campus with medical school representatives and listen to the harangues about the hospitals, but that was okay. I did it. When I first took the job, I was worried because the hospital had major financial problems. And we didn't know whether it was going to be sustainable or not. But we're losing $1 million a week. But eventually, we were able to maintain the financial equilibrium, and we got through. At that time, about 1996 now, there was merger fever going on all over the country. Hospitals were merging, medical centers were merging, and we were no different. And we tried to merge with New York University. At that time, NYU was led by a very well-known doctor named Saul Farber, and he and Bill Speck got along very well, and we agreed to a merger. And we celebrated the agreement by having a Shabbat dinner in the trustees' room of the Presbyterian Hospital with portraits of the founders, including Harkness and James Lennox. And I always wondered what they must have thought about as challah and kosher wine was being served around. But we agreed on the merger, Bill Speck and Saul Farber, and I asked Saul, I said, Saul, what about Larry Tisch, the chairman of the board? And Saul said, when you're speaking to me, you're speaking to Larry. I'd never forget those words. And the next day, Saul called me and said, the deal is off. Larry doesn't like the financial situation at the Presbyterian Hospital. I said, oh my God, how am I going to bring that to the chairman of the board? Okay, or Bill Speck, but that was the way it was. And then a couple of days later, we learned that NYU was merging with Mount Sinai, and we also learned that Larry Tisch's son was a board member of Mount Sinai. We didn't think that was a coincidence. But we had to find another partner, and we eventually found Dave Skinner and New York Hospital. And that merger has gone quite well, and it's over 20 years now, and it was the first 10 years were led by Herb Pardis, and did a very good job.
And Mount Sinai and NYU was a dismal failure, and it took them years to disengage.
It's a much like marriage. It's easy to get married, but sometimes very complicated to get divorced, and very expensive to get divorced. And that's what they've gone through for years. Right? Okay.
Okay, come on. I'll skip.
By the way, I have to say that there are at least 4 representatives of the anesthesia department here, so they will keep me to at least describe what I remember accurately. Yeah.
All right, so I went through and picked out some episodes from your very, very, very full life, and I thought that we could get some more details, but from a personal perspective, and also with a little more detail of the major contributions that you made and the people that you knew and worked with. Okay, so anybody recognize who that is? Edward. So tell us about your.
Yes. So thank you. C. Everett Koop, but most people don't know. They know that he was President Reagan's Surgeon General, but they don't know what he did for his career. He was a pediatric surgeon, and he spent most of his time at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where I was a resident. And the reason that I think it's important to know is that one day I sat at the lunch table, and it was a very small hospital in those days, and he sat down with me, and he said, Alan, what are you going to be doing with your career as a pediatrician? And I said, Dr. Koop, that really worries me, because I like hospital pediatrics, very sick patients. Meningitis was my favorite disease. And I said, most pediatricians practice in the community, in the suburbs, and they take care of basically healthy babies with rashes and bruises, and I don't think that's really cut out for me. He said, well, tomorrow, Alan, I want you to come to the operating room, and as we're setting up, you'll watch the anesthesiologist work. And it was Leonard Bachman and John, I forgot his name now. But anyway, the two.
I can't remember either.
Okay. So these were two guys that the best role models are people who seem to like what they're doing, and they enjoyed it. It was almost like play. One was giving medications, and one was recording and taking blood pressure of these little babies. And I said, that's what I want to do. And so I applied to Columbia and met Manny Papper, and I was accepted into the program.
Okay, so when Alan walked in, he said to me, "Who's that woman?"
I know who that.
And I said, "That's your wife." And then he says, "No, that's Pat Sovern, the 4th wife of our esteemed past president. The 5th? Okay, the 5th wife."
Well, 5th marriage.
5th marriage, okay. I had gone online and I found a picture of Alan with 2 women, one of whom he had his arm around. So I mistakenly thought that was his wife, but instead it was the president's wife. So here is Valerie, and that's Pat Sovern.
Right.
Good friend.
Tell us about how you met Valerie.
So about the same time that I was advised by Dr. Coop to consider anesthesia, I had been outsourced, you might say, to Camden, New Jersey, at an infectious disease hospital for 2 weeks as part of my residency at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And I had, because of the weather, the snowstorms, and I was not able to get back to the Children's Hospital for quite a while. And finally I walked in, and there she was in a beautiful red dress, and I said, that girl's for me. And I was very pushy, and she kept pushing me off, and she said, no way, I'm not getting involved with anyone at the hospital. So then I learned that Valerie was a musician and majored in music at the Boston University School of Music. And I ran over to the Academy of Music, which was the equivalent of Carnegie Hall in Philadelphia, and bought 2 tickets and for an Arthur Rubinstein concert. And I went to Valerie and I said, I have tickets for Rubinstein. On Friday, will you go out with me? And she said the magic words, what's he playing? And I said Chopin. And so we were married, and last week, was it Saturday? Yes, it was Saturday, and we celebrated our 61st anniversary. All began because of Arthur Rubinstein.
Mazel tov.
Poor Pat Salmon. Oh.
Poor Valerie.
Yeah.
Poor me.
So I just thought you would identify
Yes.
who these people are.
Yes, so on your left, well, I think you can read Virginia Apgar, and in the center is Manny Papper, and on the right is Henrik Bendix, and if you notice, the 2 on the left are smiling, and Henrik is looks a little somber.
He's
And
a Dane.
Well, he's a Dane,
He's a
that's
Dane.
true, but it's also because he was the new chairman of anesthesia, coming in at a very crucial time in the history of the department. I think it was 1974. And Virginia Apgar was wearing a corsage because it was her birthday, and the Anesthesia Society was celebrating her birthday. She lived another year. And Manny was at this time the dean of University of Miami,
Next, please.
and he became. But he was my mentor for many years, and I think some of the people in the room were probably hired by either Manny or by Henrik.
During your appointment, you applied for and got a couple of NIH fellowships.
Mhm.
The second one, you went off to Oxford to the Newfield Institute in 1964, and where you were part of a profound change in the treatment of premature infants. This is a slide of the correspondence to the preliminary correspondence with in Lancet. Preliminary communication. Can you tell us about
Yes,
this?
and by the way, I noticed on the lower right corner the names, but I wanted to tell you that the British tradition was to always list the names alphabetically. So it was actually my idea, but the idea was how to manage premature babies who had IRDS, idiopathic respiratory distress syndrome. And a man by the name of Hutchison at the University of Glasgow had published that he was managing these babies in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber, just putting them in this device and turning up the pressure of oxygen, which I thought was incredible. A year before, you may remember this, in 1963, I think it was in July, Jackie Kennedy delivered by cesarean section a baby 4-pound baby, Patrick Bouvier. Her husband was in, JFK was in Washington. The baby was flown to the Boston Children's Hospital and put it in a hyperbaric chamber and died the next day. I went to the head of the laboratory in Oxford and suggested that a protocol for studying or comparing hyperbaric oxygen and intermittent positive pressure breathing in newborn rabbits that we asphyxiated deliberately. We had about 200 animals, and it was quite evident that intermittent positive pressure breathing was far, far better than putting these animals in a hyperbaric.
For people who may not know what that means, what you did was to...
Essentially, it was like mouth-to-mouth ventilation, or if you find somebody drowning on the street, or as we apply it in the hospital for resuscitation, or just conventionally in the operating room as an anesthesiologist. This is what we're accustomed to do. And we showed the evidence to the chairman of the department, and Dr. Doris, and he said, write it up and send it to Lancet. And we sent it to Lancet, and surprisingly, they thought it was so important and so convincing that they published it without outside review. Just the editors decided on their own. It was called a preliminary communication. And that received a lot of attention because Dr. Hutchison in Glasgow was a noted specialist in the newborn. He was promoting hyperbaric oxygen. He was not happy. And nor was the biggest company, the airplane company, because they were manufacturing these hyperbaric chambers and trying to get them sold around the world. So this was a pretty important study, and we rode that one for a while.
So when you came, after this work and after your fellowship, you came back to Columbia, and Papper asked you to set up one of the first neonatal intensive care units in the world, and you told me that when you started, 9 out of 10 preemies died in a few days. 9
out of 10 babies with respiratory distress.
But you transformed them with that, with this new system of ventilation, so that you went to 1 out of 10. It's a miraculous change.
But we finally set on using what we call nasal CPAP. In other words, without an endotracheal tube and without a mechanical ventilator, but just flowing oxygen enriched air or air enriched with oxygen. And these babies seem to thrive with this change. This is before nitric oxide, by the way. I don't know if you know this, but nitric oxide completely trained. Not nitrous oxide, but nitric oxide, which is a vasodilator, a very powerful vasodilator, and dilates the vessels of the pulmonary circulation. So this was amazing. This is after my time.
I think that the entire world after COVID has come to appreciate the importance of appropriately administered ventilation in preserving the lives of people under respiratory distress. And since everything in medicine and science builds on what comes before, I think there are many people in the world who probably owe their lives today to work that you did in the 60s. When you came back, Ben Dixon became dean, and he asked you to...
No, he was chairman.
Chairman. And he asked you to focus on adults, and you started the first adult ICU.
Surgical ICU.
Surgical ICU at Columbia. And just very briefly, it's interesting because you talked to me about some of the ethical issues that arise when you have adults in these ICU intensive care situations, critical care. You want to?
So this was at a time when that coincided with the development of heart transplantation. So unlike kidney transplantation, when you can take it from a kidney from a cadaver, a real dead person, to transplant the heart has to be beating. And so we had to go through this whole ethical conversation about what is death, what is brain death compared to what conventional death. And there were great discussions about this, and I'm happy to say that it was an anesthesiologist in Boston who came up with the idea of the Harvard criteria of death. And he listed, there were several, but the most important one was that you had to have a flat EEG. There had to be no brain waves whatsoever. And that became the standard requirement to take out a beating heart and transplant it into a patient that's in heart failure. And I'm happy to say that because of the surgical department at our hospital, it became a leading center for heart transplantation. We got not only the questions of criteria, of ethical questions of advanced directives and who shall live and who may not, who can go to the next step, but there were financial considerations. I remember, we didn't mention this before, but Jimmy Carter, when he was president, came to our neonatal ICU, and he referred to them as the $1 million babies, because some of the babies actually cost $1 million to leave the hospital. So there were ethical questions, financial questions, and I was very happy working in the intensive care unit. It was something that appealed to me. I still worked in the operating room as an anesthesiologist, but it was a special area that excited me and satisfied me. And many residents, including surgical residents, came through the ICU, and many of them became my friends. And I don't know if any of you remember Jim Goodrich, who became a did any of you? Anyway, Jim Goodrich was one of my residents and also became a very close personal friend. And he was an expert at separating conjoint twins in the brain. And he was one of the first people that I knew that died of COVID when he was 70 years old. Very tragic.
So, as Monty Python people say, now for something completely different. Here you are, after all these pioneering innovations and management and ethical, really fundamental consideration of ethics. You know, this was the days before everybody had an IRB, and this was more or less cowboys. You know, that you could get away with almost anything. So you really were breaking ground, and then suddenly there you are with Bob and Liddy Dole.
Right. So serendipity has always played a big part of my life, like Valerie, meeting Valerie. And one day in Low Library, I went to a meeting, and there was Mary Mundinger, who became the dean of the School of Nursing. And I said, Mary, I haven't seen you in a while. Where have you been? She said, I've been in Washington. I've been a Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Fellow. I worked for Teddy Kennedy. I said, I don't know what that, and she explained to me how the process, and I said, I think I'd like to try that. She said, well, you got about 3 weeks before the deadline, and I had to get the whole, anyway, I did it, and I was accepted, and then I had to get a job. And most of the fellows worked for senators, and I wanted to work for Bill Bradley. My two sons worked for Bill Bradley, and he was the senator from New Jersey where we lived, and he was the ideal person that I wanted to work for. But his health policy person didn't want me because I was too mature. I was over I was about 55 years old, and I was very old to be a fellow. So I had to get another job, and I got a call from Sheila Burke, who was Dole's chief of staff, and said, come over and for an interview. And I told Bob Dole, I said, I'm a registered Democrat. You sure you want me? And he said, yes. Sheila wants you, yes. And it was a great decision because I had an office in the Capitol building because he was the Republican leader. And my desk, I could overlook the Washington Monument, Lincoln Memorial, Arlington Cemetery. It was a great place to sit and meet friends, and I had privileges to eat in the Senate dining room with the leading senators, and so it was a good time. And I enjoyed working for Bob Dole.
So what effect do you think you had on medicine or health because of that?
There were two projects that I worked on that I was very pleased with. One had to do with drug benefits under Medicare. And as you may know, that initially drugs were not covered under Medicare. Medicare just covered hospital insurance, and then came along paying some surgeons' fees and doctors' fees, but not medications. And we got Congress to agree to pay for that. And that was one accomplishment. But the most interesting to me was this was the time when AIDS became and C.F. Recruit was the Surgeon General, and he was trying to convince President Reagan that AIDS was a major public health problem, and he was not successful in doing that. In fact, it was a third rail issue. No member of Congress really wanted to get involved with AIDS. And I met a man named Admiral James Watkins. He was the chairman of the presidential, it was called presidential, but it didn't have much to do with President Reagan, commission to study the AIDS problem in America. And he was the overriding chairman. And I attended the meetings, and one day he came up to me and he said, I hear you work for Senator Dole. I said, yes. He said, do you think you could set up a meeting that I could meet with him and explain to him why this is such an important problem? And I said, I don't know, I'll try. And so I went to the administrator, and I went to Sheila Burke, and one day Sheila came and said, you can bring the Admiral over. The Senator will see him. And I said, can I sit in the meeting? And she said, you can sit in the meeting. So there were the three of us, and in a small office of Senator Dole. And they spoke about Second World War and Great War stories, and finally they got into the subject of AIDS. And Admiral Watkins convinced Dole, and Dole put up a bill the first time to authorize substantial amounts of money to study the cause and treatment of AIDS. And this was, and he didn't win many friends in the Republican Party at that time. And Jesse Helms didn't speak to him for a long time. Anyway, that's
and I think at that time you met Fauci, and
yes.
In my opinion, Fauci's ability to communicate with the public and do everything that he did was from the learning experience of the cauldron of dealing with AIDS and its victims and reconciling public policy. I'm going to skip ahead because I think people are going to have some questions. Tell us very briefly how it is that you know.
I'll be very brief. So this is a photograph that was taken in Lowell Library because Henry Kissinger spoke to our attending staff. I got to know him because I helped him care for his mother. His mother was brought into the hospital by Henry's chauffeurs, well, actually, they were his bodyguards. And every Friday, they were accustomed to pick up Henry's mother and bring her to Kent, Connecticut, where he lived on the weekends. And anyway, she was basically gone, dead, brought into the emergency room of our hospital, and she was resuscitated. And Henry's brother came in, Walter, who had the proxy for his mother, and he was very unhappy. And Henry said, no, mother should be cared for, and we managed her care in the ICU for maybe a week or so, and 4 days later, she recovered, but well enough to go to Puerto Rico on vacation. And so Henry was right. Anyway, we became associates. I can't say close friends, but he was helpful when I applied to be a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, which I've enjoyed, and so we know each other. And I think Henry is now 98 years old. Yeah.
So that's a whole other side of your life, and that is your continuing interest in foreign relations and the work that you do for projects like Seeds of Peace.
Yeah.
Can you talk about very briefly?
In the introduction, it was mentioned that I help settle affairs between children. That's not quite the way it happened. A close friend, John Wallach, was the founder of Seeds of Peace, and I was an early supporter and maybe an early founder. This is an organization that brings together young people from areas of conflict, particularly between Palestinians and Israelis. And we have they have a camp in Maine, and the young people come to camp, and we have them wrestle with their problems in a nice environment. And I can't say it has settled all the issues, but it's been a step forward.
So this is interesting because you've sent me various versions of this slide. This is the Wall of Distinction from Madison High School, where you share on which you are featured with Bernie Sanders and Chuck Schumer and Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
The lady on the top row, second from the left, is RBG.
I was about to get to that. I don't know how they do it on late night where they manage to get the whole question out. But so it's interesting to me how meaningful to you getting this award appears to be, and this is the write-up, and I think that for all of us, and especially all of us in our careers, where we have worked with students and helped them to move on to other places, you can appreciate the importance of recognizing a brilliant, motivated young person and helping them to move forward. Just tell us about Mr. Schwartz. Do you actually know Mr. Schwartz's first name?
No.
Because I don't.
No.
None of us know our high school kids'
No.
teachers' first names.
So my first day at James Madison, I graduated in the off year. So I started high school in February, whereas most people start in September. So there were very few in my class. So my first day, I walk in, and there was my cousin, who was we called him a BMOC. He was a senior and very important in James Madison High School. And he said to me, "Alan, why are you wearing a tie?" And I said, "I wanted to make a good impression." He said, "Take it off. You're going to give me a bad reputation." And he said, "What's in the envelope?" I said, "It's $1 for the Parents Association." He says, "They're the enemy. Keep the dollar." "And what language are you going to be taking?" The only option you had was the foreign language. And I said, "I'm taking Spanish." Everybody takes Spanish. It's supposed to be the easiest language. He says, No. What shall I take?" "Take German." I said, "German? We just had a war. It's only 3 years ago. We had fighting they were our enemy." He says, "No, take German because the teacher is Mr. Schwartz, and he is the best teacher in the school, and that's who you'll have. So I took my cousin's advice, and I walked into the German class, and there were 5 people in the class, 4 of whom spoke German at home. and I did very well, and Mr. Schwartz took a liking to me, and I had him for all of the time, every semester at Madison. And finally, as a senior, he said he wanted to see me, and he said, "Where are you going to college?" And I said, "I'm going to Brooklyn College like everybody." And he said, "No, you should go to Columbia." I said, "I can't go to Columbia." I said, it's very expensive and it's too far. He says, "I'll show you." And he took me on the subway, and he went with me and showed me the campus. The first time I came out the subway and I saw the campus, and I applied, and I got in, and it was all because of Mr. Schwartz.
Well, you were lucky to get in. There was a pretty stiff quota system for, I think Frank reminded me that Isaac Asimov had to go in as a general in the School of General Studies because...
He actually went to Brooklyn. There was a subsidiary of Columbia in somewhere in Brooklyn.
He started at Seth Low Community
That's what it was called, yeah.
Then he transferred to what was University Extension,
Okay.
the predecessor.
But it was called Seth Low Community College in Brooklyn, and it was set up by Nicholas Murray Butler for Jewish kids to go, basically. So they wouldn't have to go
Jewish boys to go.
Jewish boys to go.
And let's keep this straight here.
That's right.
Just want to bring, in 2017, you received, I am not responsible for these pictures, I just put them up here. You received an honorary Doctor of Science from the university, and there you are next to Eric Holder. And you sent me this picture, and I said to you, who's that man you're standing next to? And you said, "Well, that's my son, Dr. Joshua Hyman." And I want to play just a little tiny clip because I think when you listen to this clip from Joshua Hyman, you will appreciate the kind of people that Alan and Valerie Hyman are.
I can't say that I have a favorite part about working with kids because I really like all aspects of working with kids. Kids are resilient. Kids are also innately happy and optimistic. Although they have a problem or a complaint, they are not bogged down by it. It doesn't color their entire outlook. They also will often be very engaged in their treatment. They want to get better. I think working with kids is not only interesting, but it's downright fun. And I also like working with the parents. As a parent of 4 children, one of whom has had multiple surgeries, I think I can relate to some of the fears and anxieties that parents have around their child's medical care. And part of my satisfaction is knowing that I can make them feel better about the entire situation. My name is Joshua Hyman. I am a pediatric orthopedic surgeon with Columbia Doctors at New York Presbyterian, Morgan Stanley Children's Hospital.
So the other intriguing, the one before was a quote about from the Torah, and actually in your little write-ups that you sent me, you make a number of allusions to Talmud, to Torah, and to the relationship between healing and life and living. But then you sent this picture of a rainbow over Columbia, and I was intrigued by why you did this and how this all hangs together, who you are.
I should send this to Lee Bollinger because this was at commencement, and for many years I have been the escort of the honorees coming out of the library and getting their honorary degrees. So I think it was last year or maybe 2 years ago, I think it was last year, I sat there and looked up in the sky and there was a rainbow, but it was a circular rainbow. I had never seen that before, and I took a photograph with my phone, and I didn't know whether it would come out, but there it is. So a circle right over the campus, and it was during Lee Bollinger's talk, and so I should send it to him and say look what you did.
So I just want to, before we open this up for questions, I want to just say that Alan dropped over an envelope of notes and pictures to my office, and I wasn't there, and he gave it to one of the other professors in the department, who sent me a little note and said, a lovely gentleman came by and left an envelope for you. And so then I wrote back to Elena and said, this is who the lovely gentleman was. And then she said, oh, he just said that he was a retired anesthesiologist and critical care doctor, and with no pretension, and she's also a pretty hard-bitten woman. So for her to think that you were lovely is really something. And I think that to me that says an awful lot, and I feel really privileged to be able to sit here and talk with you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Do people have questions?
I have a comment, if I may. I'm not a physician, Dr. Acevedo is my husband, but you mentioned something that has touched me for a long time, and it's C for peace. My daughter, Lisandra Ramos, she graduated from Union College. She has 2 masters from NYU. And she was part of that program in Maine.
Oh.
And I was very impressed when I found out that it was between Palestinian and Jewish youngsters. We went up there. I still have a beautiful memory of one of the motels that we stayed at, the whitest bedspread and things that I have ever seen in my life. But I always said, if we could only let people know what is going on and how much effort is being made to really bridge that gap, it would be beautiful. So I want to thank you for your involvement, and my appreciation for the program goes even beyond the feeling that I had, knowing that you were there and that I can see you and your experience. Thank you very much.
Well, John is gone. He died 25 years ago, but his wife lives on, and she's still very dedicated to Seas of Peace. Yes. So I'll bring that message to her.
Thank you.
Peter, do you want to?
Ellen, I was really struck by that wonderful rabbit experiment, and I'm wondering what you think the chances are that such an experiment would be allowed today. Asphyxiating so many rabbits?
Right. No, I think we'd have to present it to an IRB, or animal care IRB, and I don't know, because these rabbits were not anesthetized before they were asphyxiated. So I don't know whether we would be able to get it through. And by the way, Peter is not only a friend, he's a neighbor. Are you calling from Stockbridge?
Yeah, sure.
So we share the lake, so to speak, up in Stockbridge.
I think you would get rodents through the IRB as long as you showed that they didn't suffer. But you'd never be able to get monkeys through these days.
Yeah. You know, but actually, Mehmet Oz, you know, who's running for senator from Pennsylvania, but although he lives in New Jersey, he's been accused by his opponent. I forgot his name now. Fetterman. But for abusing animals, and I think he killed a couple hundred dogs, so that's what they found to accuse him of. Yes. Yeah. By the way, Mehmet Oz really was is probably the leading heart transplant surgeon in the country while he was still active, and very, very good surgeon.
His Eric Rose, who you obviously know well, said that Mehmet was technically the best heart surgeon he had ever seen.
And coming from Eric, that's a great compliment, right?
A question about the preemies that you helped to save. How did they do in the long run?
That's a very good question. It's always, back of your mind, what are you accomplishing? And John Driscoll, Michael knows John, who recently passed away, was the director of the neonatal ICU after we were moved to adults. And he has followed these babies, and now they're adults. And most of them did quite well. Yeah, so that's a very good question.
If you were finishing your residency now, what do you think you'd be looking forward to over the next decade?
I think if I had a choice of, anesthesia is divided into three divisions. One is the conventional operating room care. Second is pain management, mostly chronic pain management. And I don't think that would be for me. But the third is critical care medicine. Most anesthesiologists no longer go into critical care medicine. It's become a position that is dominated by pulmonologists. But some still do. And one of the, I think, most significant things that I've done in the last decade or so was to endow a chair in critical care medicine as part of anesthesiology, because I'd like to encourage, and I'm not sure, but I think we have about a dozen fellows, anesthesiologists specializing in critical care. So I think it's an exciting field. It has the ethical components, and it certainly has the family components. I mean, people always say, or often say, well, you don't really get involved with family affairs. Well, when you're in the ICU, you see the best and the worst of families. There are so many stories, and I come home and tell Valerie. So one of the worst examples I ever had was a man who was we declared him as brain dead, and his 3 children who live locally agreed. But then a son came in from San Francisco who hadn't seen his father in a decade. And he said, absolutely not, we must carry on. So so there was fighting between the family members. And so it's a very stressful, but also very satisfying position. I'm glad I did it. And I'm happy to have had the opportunity. And also working with people like Carolyn and Hoshi and Eric and
actually, I'd like to say thank you to Alan. Alan was a young attending when I began my anesthesia career as a resident, and I actually had you the first month. He was my attending. They did not turn us loose in the operating room for quite a while, and we worked one-on-one that first month, I guess in July, and you were always very, very supportive of me right from the start and all through my career. The only one thing is you did ask me to diagram the structure of curare during my first month of residency, and that was something I couldn't do, and I can't do it now either. And I don't even know if you can do it.
That's why I asked you to do it.
And especially later on, I became the medical director of ambulatory surgery. And I had absolutely no administrative experience at all. And it was a very challenging position for me. And Alan was always behind me every step of the way, encouraging me first to take the position, and then secondly, to actually hopefully perform well in that position. And so I'm very, very grateful to Alan. He's always been extremely supportive of me, and thank you.
I'm so glad my wife is here. You know, I'm glad that you mentioned ambulatory surgery, because the anesthesia has really changed the nature of the hospital. Because, as I mentioned earlier about Professor Dawson coming in a day or two before surgery, because nowadays most surgery is done same day. You come in the morning, and it's like going to the dentist. You come in and you go home after the procedure, and it's all because of the methodology that was started by a group of anesthesiologists, actually in Arizona, who started the surgery centers. And when I first heard about this, and I think it was in the early 70s, that patients were going home after general anesthesia. I couldn't imagine that. And that has become, so if we were designing a hospital today, it would be very different. The Milstein Hospital building was the last hospital, I think, that was designed the old-fashioned way, where the intention was that patients would come in before surgery and stay over a few days, and then have the operation and then stay a number of days afterwards. And that's not the way hospitals should be designed. Hospitals are really for very sick people, not for surgical patients.
They're completely gutting the Eye Institute.
Yeah.
That's going to be the new cancer center, and then they'll redo Ashley for some, whatever they call Ashley these days, for some Irving for something else.
Yes.
Yeah.
Other, I think your career parallels the development of HIV/AIDS, and how do you see it looking back? How AIDS impacted all aspects of the responsibilities you have?
Well, I'll just give you one example. When I started, anesthesiologists, except when they were doing some very special procedures, never wore gloves. Didn't wear gloves in the operating room. And we intubated patients without wearing gloves, and we used reusable. The whole idea of disposable equipment didn't exist. We used metal needles. We didn't have plastic intravenous tools. Blood was in bottles, not in bags. and the bottles were reused. You had to send them back. I mean, it has dramatically changed, and AIDS changed the behavior in the operating room, of the entire staff. Yes.
Well, occupational health is what I've done for most of my life.
Tell them about scavenging.
Well, the operating theater, the surgical suite is still probably the most dangerous place in the hospital. The surgeons in particular, I think, consider themselves he-men. And so there's many ergonomic, just working positions that if you designed an assembly line for cars, you would never have people working in the postures. And then the gases from the waste anesthetic gases are a problem. There is scavenging now. It used to be you just inhaled them all. Now there is scavenging, but it's not all that effective, especially for long procedures. And then surgeons do things like laser surgery, which generates surgical plumes, including live viruses if they are doing on anything that has moles or warts. So it's come a long way, but there's still an awful long way to go in the surgical suite.
Well, we used at least 4 or 5 different vapors, ranging from ether to fluorine, and halothane and so forth, and ethylene even. And my wife could always tell what anesthetic gas I used that day when I came home and gave her a hello kiss, and she said, I think it's ethylene, isn't it ethylene? And I said, yes.
That reminded me of the story when the first factory tour I took was on people who made dyes in Paterson, New Jersey, because there's the waterfall there, so a lot of old manufacturing was sited by the water power. And when the guys who would stir the vats would come home, the women always knew what color they were making by the collars, because they inhaled it and they excreted it. So you were just up the social ladder with the same exact exposure. Are there any other questions? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeanne.
Thank you so much. We really, really appreciated your taking the time to be with us.
Thank you, Jeanne.